Hey everybody. Woo! I'm here with Merikay Waldvogel, and we're going to talk about the Century of Progress quilts that are now showing at the in Fabric of a Nation. I'm going to hold up that book for you guys. Fabric of a Nation at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. If you watched my previous episode of On the Road, you saw that I spoke with Jennifer Swope, the curator there, about these two quilts. And I said a few times, let's find out what Merikay has to say about that. So now we're here with Merikay and we can hear what she has to say about all of that. So welcome, Merikay.
Thank you, Tara. It's fun being with you always. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming.
And giving me a chance to talk about these two quilts.
Yeah, specifically, I think the Rowley quilt, if you wanted to jump into that one, because I think that was in your collection for about 20 years, right?
That's right. Yeah. When Barbara Brackman and I wrote Patchwork Souvenirs and we're preparing for that, you want to show that book? There you go.
Yeah, that's this one.
That's that one. It came out, I think, 1993. 93. So there was a lead up. We were looking for quilts to go in that book. And Barbara had these black and white photos from Sears archives that were taken in 1934 of some of the quilts that had been entered in this National Quilt Contest. And it was in Chicago for the Chicago World's Fair, the Century of Progress.
Yeah.
And she was trying to track down as many quilts as she could that were in the final round. There were 30 quilts that reached the final round. And then there were these quilts that were original designs, and Sears was actually offering an extra $100 bonus if indeed one of those quilts reached the grand prize level, and that top grand prize was $1,000. And luckily, unluckily, the judges around the country didn't particularly like those original quilts. So there weren't any that reached the final round, although we might consider the Spectrum quilt an original design, and we're going to look at that later. But the people in Chicago who had made these original designs, lots of which had symbolism from the Century of Progress or the history of Chicago, they worked hard on those quilts. It was just they just had three, from January 15th to May 15th to get them done. I guess that's 4 months. And they didn't reach the final round, and a lot of them got, a little upset about it, including Ida Stowe. And so they convinced Sears to repeat an exhibit in the summer of 1934 in the Sears Pavilion at the World's Fair. And so Sears called back the top 9 quilts of the contest, and they had an exhibit. It looks like it's in the room next door. And this is at the Sears Pavilion on the World's Fair site. Anyway, they took pictures. One of the pictures was of this bird's eye view of the World's Fair site. And remember, these photos are in black and white, and they were excellent photos. And on the bird's eye view, you could actually read the tag. It was so clear that we were able, with a magnifying glass, to see that it says A Century of Progress, and it says entered by Mrs. Louise Rowley, and she lived on Thorndale Avenue in Chicago. Her address was there, and that my heart started just pitter-pattering, thinking, I lived like a block from there. I taught at Senn High School, which is right near there. And I thought, Thorndale, I know where that is. Well, again, lead up to the book, we tried to find that quilt and we couldn't. And so all we did was put the photo in the book, the black and white photo, and then we made a little layout of the World's Fair site. And we used that quilt we had a chapter on the Century of Progress World's Fair itself. And we used that quilt to point out the different buildings at the fair. It's a great quilt, and remember, it's in black and white.
Yeah. I found it. It's
Yeah.
right here on page 13. If you have your patchwork souvenirs out, everyone.
Oh,
There it is.
I know. So it's not a very big picture, but anyway, let's see, jump forward. Okay, the book, there were all the quilts in there traveled around the country, including the Spectrum, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but it traveled all over the country. Barbara and I did lectures. I gave up my day job. It was just that's when my career really began. And it was just a great experience. Well, anyway, in 1998, let's say end of 1997, quilts are all, the exhibit's over. We're still talking about it. We got lots of people all over the country telling us about, oh, there are other quilts out here, and you should have had this one in the book and that one in the book. And some of the state quilt projects were still going on. Wisconsin found some. Anyway, it was around Christmas time. Maine Antique Digest had a full page auction advertisement and said that there was going to be an auction on January 1st, 1998 in North Georgia. And here was a black and white picture of the quilt with the name tag still on it. And I'm like, other people started sending us copies of this. And they're saying, Mary Kay, you've got to go, because it's real. And I realized how close it was. And so Jerry and I went, my husband and I went on, it was New Year's Eve. We spent New Year's Eve there. And the next day we walked in, and it was the first time I saw this quilt in color. And I was just blown away with it. I had no idea the background was all blue, but I guess it should have been. It was against Lake Michigan, and it had, the World's Fair laid out. And because I'd lived in Chicago, I realized that, that area was still there. And at the time, there was an airstrip on that in 1998. Since then, they've taken that up, and it's now a park.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So a lot of people know, but well, anyway, so I sat there in that auction, and I came in with the book. I talked to them ahead of time to make sure that this was the quilt. And they said, yep, it is. Well, anyway, you're supposed to go to an auction and be kind of incognito. Well, this auctioneer was just like, look at her, she's the author, and I really didn't think I would purchase it, but I knew what the quilts were being appraised for, the ones that had traveled with the exhibit. And I thought, well, I'll go up to that amount. I never spent that much on a quilt before. And there were people bidding on the phone, and I ended up getting it, and they cheered in the audience.
Oh.
So anyway, here's the kicker. And of course, we bought other things there too. Jerry bought globes and scales, and oh my, we came home with all kinds of things. And so you go back then and pay for your thing. And so they handed me the quilt, and on top of it was a note. I still have the note. And see, anyway, the note says something like, this quilt was made by Richard H. Rowley. He put his mother's name on the quilt entry, thinking the judges wouldn't believe that a man had made it. And that's all it was. So I had this name, Richard H. Rowley, and it was signed, and I could hardly read the signature. It looks like Connie. But I thought, what, Georgia? What are we talking about here? How did it get to Georgia?
Right.
There we go. So I had it 20 years, and I like you say, I got very close to it. I really did a lot of research on trying to figure out where this man, how he traveled and what his job was. And I found him, he traveled a lot. He moved around a lot. He lived in Chicago, but he moved in 1930, he was actually living in New York as an architectural draftsman. And then he goes back to Chicago and he ends up in California. His Social Security death index, and that's the only thing we had back in, this is pre-ancestry.com, but really it was in early 2000s. That's all I had was a Social Security death index. And it said he died in California. Now, what is the quilt doing in Georgia? Well, that was the fun of it. And it turns out that he worked for the state of California as an architect in 1940s and 50s. His son was born about 1950, and the son went to school in Georgia. That's what happened. And so Richard was older. He and his wife were older, like retirement age. And to be with him, they moved to North Georgia, and he actually died in North Georgia. So there you go.
Wow.
And that's how the quilt ended up there. So, and he died, Richard died in 1968. So the son apparently had the quilt all that time. I mean, you always wonder when you're a quilt historian, how could somebody let this go? But I think they were downsizing, and I don't know for sure, but they gave these things to a local auction house. And so now I have to prove, is it true? And what I ended up doing was finding the application for Richard Rowley's Social Security number in 1936. And the handwriting matches exactly that on the entry tag. Now, so I knew, and then I could, and then also on the Social Security, I got the app. It takes a while back then to even get that information, but I knew then his parents' names, and they were both from England. But the names, although Rowley seems unusual, there are a lot of Rowleys, but I was able to eventually track it all back. And even when I saw your little visit to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, I went back and looked at all that information again. And, where you speculate, and I do too, that his mother, I liked what you said when you said maybe he did the design and maybe cut out the templates and she put it together. It's an incredible feat when you look at the detail in that quilt, the applique, the little umbrellas, the layering on the buildings, really the embroidery. It's just the quilting. I mean, and it's big. It's really a big quilt. And the amount of work that's on it, I just cannot believe a man made it all by himself. I like the idea that it's a collaborative piece. His mother, then I went looking for his mother, and she kind of disappears too. Even today, I don't know where she's buried. But anyway, so it's Richard Rowley, ending up in Georgia. He's buried in Georgia. Is that amazing? And you live in Georgia.
And I live in Georgia.
I live in Georgia. It's just,
I just don't, we don't know anything else he sewed, but we know that we have evidence that she was a quilt maker already. So it just doesn't make sense that she didn't execute on that. It doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
So
yeah. So anyway, so that's that story. And it's in a great place right now. And I want to say thank you to the museum for taking it and for exhibiting it so soon and for having it in a book.
yeah.
And I'm glad to think that thousands of people are going to get to see it. So.
Yeah, I think people have been really drawn to that one. I know Jennifer was really happy to have it in the exhibition, and also in that catalog I just showed you guys as well. which is really hefty. But
Mhm.
it's got some great photographs in here with that quilt as well. So, and it, like you said, it's big. It's really much bigger than
Yeah,
you
the
think
size,
of
I
it.
don't really know the exact size, but it really covered the a bed, a double bed.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah, it's so bird's eye view, I was calling it 77 by 86. But indeed, he wrote A Century of Progress. That's the name of it that he put on it. So
Well, you hold it up for our audience. The Quilters newsletter. If you guys have access to back copies of Quilters newsletter magazine, this is the May 2001. Yep.
and it's an article. It really has most of the photos. It is the best update on. I get best meaning most complete update on the contest. So yeah, May 2001. Okay.
Thank you. And you said you found the size was listed in there, 77 by 86.
Correct.
See, that's a really big quilt.
Very big quilt, yes. Today, I mean, handling it. I mean,
Yeah.
and the waves on the back in the water, they're parallel lines. At first, I thought maybe it was in the first time in the black and white picture, it looked kind of like maybe it was a commercial, commercial or machine quilted backing, and then they applicate things down, but it's not. It's all by hand.
Yeah.
And then I always like the wake behind the boat going up to. I always like that. I was just,
It's an interest. It's a clever detail, isn't it?
Yeah, and I like going back to it because I think it gives me a real feeling of what the fair looked like, and you could come in from the middle right. That was really where the Sears building was, and Sears wanted their pavilion to be the welcome, like the visitor center. Come in here. We're the first ones that you're going to see. Sit down with us. They had lockers. They had lots of places to sit, and terraces to sit down outside. And then they had the quilt exhibit there. And they also had something about their mail order business too, a big exhibit about that. But anyway, and then you go to the right and you go down towards where all the fun was. And today, if you're from Chicago, you're looking south, that would be kind of where McCormick Place is now. We're not looking north, we're looking south, and McCormick Place is down there. And then the Adler Planetarium, of course, and Shed Aquarium. So it's really looking south. It's from the loop looking south. So I also say about the contest that it might have been the first burst of art quilts, original designs, because Sears offered that $1,000 extra and people took the challenge. We actually saw a lot of original designs being made in the United States. And I'm not, and even let's look at the Spectrum.
Yeah, the Spectrum quilt by that's Edith Matthews.
In Winnemucca, Nevada.
In where?
Winnemucca, Nevada.
Winnemucca.
Now, that sounds like it's out in the middle of nowhere, and of course it is. But it's on a railroad went through there, and it's a leafy little town, a little Victorian town. My husband and I went there a couple of years. I just wanted to try to find where she lived and what her house might have looked like. And we stayed overnight and had breakfast at the local place. And it's, you know, it's a going little town, it still is kind of an active little town, northern Nevada. And it turns out, and now, well, turns out now we could do more things like newspapers.com and Ancestry. And it turns out we learned a little, I've learned a few more specifics about her, that she, her husband was like an engineer, a government, well, he may not think, but he was working with dams, with hydroelectric dams, with, he was a forest ranger. He worked kind of throughout Nevada, and he helped, I'm sure he helped, you know, like Richard Rowley, who was a dress person. You could really see his design skills in the perspective on that on his quilt, Bird's Eye View. The same thing I think is going on with the Spectrum. For him, I can see him doing the compass. Now, maybe she did it too, but I mean, who knows? But his skills are definitely on view in the design of that whirl of colors, and
Yeah,
oh my gosh, it's just amazing.
it's
You saw it.
extraordinary.
Yeah,
It's extraordinary, and it also is massive.
right.
You have no idea when you see it in these photographs how bright and vibrant it is and how massive it is. And I'm just so, I get goosebumps the fact that I got to stand right next to it. I'm still just really excited about that. And I wonder, now this could be my romanticizing it, right? But I wonder if, you know, and I'll preface it with, women didn't always have the opportunity to pursue those sorts of careers, even when they had the aptitude for it. So perhaps she had the aptitude herself, and although she didn't do it as a profession, the engineering bit, maybe they both shared that common interest, and maybe she drafted it herself, even though her husband was the professional engineer. So that's my fantasy.
It turns out too that over the years we've had letters from the family. This is a quilt that Barbara, I guess Barbara first wrote about the contest, I think in 1984, maybe, in Quilter's newsletter. And the family, she showed that black and white picture of the 10, really it's just 9, but anyway, 10, the top regional winners. And the family could see the swirling quilt in that black and white, and they contacted Quilter's newsletter first, and then they passed it on to Barbara, and they said, we own this. This is our family. We own this quilt, and so that was the beginning of that connection. And they were just very enthusiastic. The family, they've shown it in Oregon. The family has moved around with the quilt, and it's descended through different generations. It's my understanding the family still owns it, and it's on loan to the Boston Museum of Art from their family. They've had a great, apparently this great, would have been their great aunt. She didn't have children. Edith, they just adored her. And she was kind of a character in Winnemucca. The first story that really caught Barbara and my attention was that she was known as the Bobcat Lady. She apparently had a pet bobcat. I don't know. You know, the fun about doing these this kind of interview is, I think back, I've been in this business a while, and you think back 25, 30 years, and somebody like Joyce Gross, oh, she was so much fun. And she was a quilt historian, and she heard too that this quilt had been found, and off she went. You know, got in her car, she was near retirement, and maybe her husband went along, and she went to Winnemucca and she wanted to see this quilt, or maybe it was Oregon where the family was at that point, but they showed her the quilt. So she saw it with her own eyes, and all the letters that came from Sears. And she even had, the family still had a piece of brown paper that had the the swirls marked, how the design.
You're kidding.
Kidding is right. I'm not kidding. That's what it. So Joyce Gross wrote about that in her book called Quilter's Journal, and that I think is on, all of those are scanned on the Quilt Index. So anyway, but just to think about her, Joyce, we all just had fun, with, this is all before ancestry. You could sit now and do a lot of quilt research, but back then it was like, well, let's just get in the car and go see this. And that's kind of what I did with the bird's eye view, I called it then. Just say, hey, Jerry, we're not doing anything on New Year's Eve. Let's go to North Georgia. Let's go to this awesome. I had no idea what this treasure would lead to, but treasure hunt, but so it's fun.
Sometimes when you follow a spark like that, it changes your whole life.
Yeah, it has.
And it has.
One aspect of doing quilt research and finding the quilts and then putting them on display is that quilt makers want to make copies. And I thought, surely these are 2 quilts nobody would ever attempt. Well, I know at least 2 people who've made Spectrum.
Really? Who are those people?
Well, one was, I don't have their name right here, but one actually was displayed and she won a prize at Paducah. And I remember going to Paducah that year. It was in the 90s, and seeing the quilt, and I'm going, I was just taken aback. I thought, oh, it was almost sacrilege to make a copy of this, in my mind, iconic Spectrum quilt. But you step away from that and you think, well, people, she was thrilled with it, the maker, and she made a copy of it, and she did write to us. She and her husband worked on the quilt, they designed it, and then they entered it. And it doesn't have quite it's made exactly the same. Of course, it's 1990s solid fabric, so it doesn't look quite the same. But anyway, yeah. This is the funny part of it. So where did she see the quilt? Well, she got the quilt from Patchwork Souvenirs. And if you look at Patchwork Souvenirs, it's backwards.
Yes.
You noticed that?
I remember you telling me, yeah, and then I noticed it after I looked at it, but it's a mirror image because the swirls in real life go the other way.
Right. And you could even, it was like, oh my, you could see in the black and white picture next to it, with the original, there is Edith Matthews standing there with her quilt, and the swirls go just the opposite way.
Yeah. And so did this woman who remade it and it showed in Paducah, didn't she make it the way she saw it in your book?
Exactly. So we know she didn't make a copy. I just think it's kind of funny, but
that's fun.
But Barbara said that there's someone in her sewing group who's making one too. Maybe we should put that on.
I wonder if we should have a Spectrum challenge.
Ooh, that would be something.
Because I'll pop in some photos of the points, but you guys watching who saw my episode where I was speaking with Jen in front of the quilt heard me talk about those points, and she has Edith has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different colors coming together in a point, and then it lays just perfectly flat at those intersections, and that is not easy to do in that perfectly as a quilter. I mean, that is experience, that is skill of the highest. So that would be a real challenge for people. Maybe we should do something like that.
It would be fun.
And have a show.
I think of another little error that's in the book, because the first people told us this was the owners at the time said that it was her first quilt. And
Mm-mm.
And then later, his name was Finn Kinnaman. He was who we were referring to. He's since passed away, but he wrote us this nice letter and said, I need to tell you that I was mistaken. You know, she in fact did make quilts, kind of as a professional quilt maker there in Winnemucca for other people. So she had the skills, and I kind of remember that she was a home ec kind of teacher too. So she had the skills, but I loved the white in the center, the white blob in the center with all the rays coming out. And I remember the first quilt I ever made, I thought, oh, I'll make a lone star. You know, you end up as a newbie quilter with this big hole in the center. And I think, well, how did that happen? You know, and I look at that and I think, well, she too had to make some kind of arrangement. She, I think, was calling it originally on that piece of paper, the brown piece of paper with the designs on it, she called it swirling comets. Swirling
Ooh.
comets. But when she entered it in the contest, it was named The Spectrum. And she won first place in the Western region. And the Western region was, you had to send your quilts to Los Angeles. And that region did produce 3 distinct types of quilts. The top 3 winners. One was hers. The second one was a Century of Progress quilt from Prescott, Arizona. And it has a lot of symbolism in it. And the third one was a typical, it was a very nicely made applique quilt, kind of a Rose of Sharon quilt from Selma, California. We've never found that quilt, but we found the one from Prescott. So of the top 30, we're still looking for 3 or 4 quilts. We've never found them. And I think it's because there were some professional quilt makers in that group, and they were contacted and they sold those quilts, or they've just gotten out in the population, and people don't know what they have. But
Right.
something like Spectrum stands out.
Does it
Yeah.
ever? Holy cow.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you know, you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Ida Stowe. Can you tell us who Ida Stowe is and how she relates to these stories?
Well, she lived in Park Ridge, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. She worked for the Otis Elevator Company, and they had an office downtown. And she, I call her the little mouse that roared, because she made a quilt. It's gray on the background, steel gray, and has this big swirling comet in the center, and it is the logo of the Century of Progress. And in beautiful, in applique letters, she has 1893, 1933. And then in the quilting, all around in the open area, she has transportation, she has all kinds of things that relate to that 100 years of Chicago. And anyway, she entered it in Chicago. And Chicago, they had maybe 6 Sears stores. So you just took it to your local store, and you had to deal with the judges who were, you know, working at that particular store. And so she writes this letter to Sue Roberts, who was the overall manager of the contest. Sue Roberts, like Sears Roebuck, she took a name, Sue Roberts. And Sue Roberts was on the radio and was promoting the contest. Well, anyway, when Ida found out that the local judges were just turning their noses up at these one-of-a-kind quilts, she wrote to Sue and said she was just offended by it, you know, that surely you ask for an original design and the judges are just overlooking these. Maybe they're giving them green ribbons, but they're not passing them on as the top one. So anyway, she's a little mouse that roared. And she, you know, the grand prize winning quilt was going to Mrs. Roosevelt, the new first lady. And she says something at the end. I'm just sure Miss Roosevelt would be, you know, upset if she could see these other interesting quilts then. So anyway, Sue Roberts took her criticism, and I'm sure she was getting other criticism, but here's Ida writes it down. And so Sue decides then in 1934 to bring those Chicago made quilts that were in the theme of the World's Fair for a special showing in 1934. And to her credit, that's the only time Sears took pictures of those kinds of quilts. So if that hadn't happened, if that 1934 exhibit hadn't happened, and they didn't take the pictures, we would have no record at all of those quilts. It's really, you know, we make a big deal about this. I make a big deal about this, the impact of this 1933 contest, but I don't think Sears, I don't think they realized what they had unleashed, because I really do think that they prompted people to really, you know, make something quickly in 4 months, get it done. They offered a huge prize. There were 24,000 quilts were actually entered. You wonder how many were started and never finished. I just think they really deserve credit for coming up with the idea and doing it, but I just don't think they were aware of the impact. And it wasn't until the 70s, late 70s or early 80s that really when Barbara Brackman was back there in Chicago and started poking around and she actually went to the Sears archives and met Lenore Swiskin, and she shared with her just a few files that were left from the contest, and that's where the photos were. And you know, Sears has moved since. They went to the Sears building, and now that's closed, and now the archives I think are in Virginia. So Barbara wrote about it, Joyce Gross took it up, and it became kind of the holy grail, you know. And then, you know, we haven't even talked about where the grand prize winning quilt went to Mrs. Roosevelt and it disappeared. And we know now that the woman who won didn't put a stitch in that quilt. She was a professional quilt maker in Eastern Kentucky who had hired women in the mountains to do different aspects of that quilt, the piecing, the design, the stuffing, and she was smart enough not to send it to the nearby regional office, which would have been Memphis, or even Atlanta, because people knew about Miss Caden and her quilt shop. They knew that she wasn't a quilter, and she had signed something. This is entirely of my own making. Instead, she sent it directly to one of those stores in Chicago.
She cheated.
There are definitely people even today who enter contests who think about who the judges are. They think about, you know. So she was smart. She was looking for something that would improve her business. But that quilt is gone. You know, we don't know where that quilt is. The quilt went to Mrs. Roosevelt, and we're not sure if she just decided. She probably knew the story too. We just don't know if she handed it off to somebody, if she deep sixed it. It's not in the White House art collection at all. So.
Okay, and it's not at, okay. And wasn't there some theory or rumor that she gave it to one of her maids or servants at the White House?
Yeah, well, I think that story comes from what we just did with Richard Rowley. You know, we're kind of putting the pieces together and thinking his mother probably worked it out with him, but we don't know for sure. But with Mrs. Roosevelt, you know, that is the idea that maybe she gave it to one of her maids or a close friend. And, you know, we've all tracked that down, but that doesn't seem to hold up.
Yeah.
We haven't found the quilt. And then the quilt itself could have been reproduced, because Miss Caden sold the pattern to Mountain Mist in 1950, and a lot of people started making the quilt.
Yeah, because that's another thing about that winning quilt. It was not one of the Century of Progress themed quilts,
Right,
that they had really, you know, asked for, that
right.
Sears had asked for, you know, make it in the theme, and it was a very traditional quilt that won.
Well
In fact,
made.
all the prize winning quilts weren't they?
Well, this one there's at least two. There's one from Prescott, and there's one from Philadelphia that are in the theme.
Okay. So there were the top winning of the whole thing was this quilt that was not even made by the person who claimed it.
Right. And they were, you know, the other two, well, they were the ones that got attention at the time were traditional quilts, or quilts that were like the judges seemed to prefer commercially made patterns. And for example, the Hubert Vermeeren designs, Home Art Company designs out of Iowa, they were big splashy colors of like yellows. And the one that won in Atlanta was Star of France, and it's probably those colors. And the one from Philadelphia that won first place in Philadelphia was a big rising sun, and it was in yellows and oranges. So they were, I mean, well, you just don't know how judges end up looking at quilts.
Right. And they always bring their own bias and their own preferences to.
But in the end, I think people were looking for a Century of Progress block, you know, something that would say, this depicts the excitement of this summer. And the Chicago Tribune they came up with a design. It's kind of Star of Tourists, and in oranges and yellows. And they did get permission from the World's Fair, whatever, commission to use that as a Century of Progress block. And then several other companies, newspaper patterns, put out their own Century of Progress blocks. But the Sears contest, the outcome did not produce that. They ended up looking at well-made quilts. I mean, the judges preferred well-made, traditional, kind of classic designs. And they definitely missed an opportunity to focus on something very modern that might have captured the attention of the quilt world, and might have changed the look of quilts during the 30s.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to go back to something you said a little earlier, Mary Kay, about, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you mentioned how this was one of the first things that might have launched an art quilt movement, so to speak, you know, way before our current art quilt movement that started, I think, in the 80s. And then of course the quilts on the wall in the museum at the Whitney in 71. And this predates all of that. And while there were some, you know, unique art quilts prior to the World's Fair in 33, this would be the first time when they were made on this scale and hung publicly, right? So that had to have made an impact in the collective consciousness of makers, right?
Yeah. Well, if they were displayed, they may have simply gone back home, you know, and quietly settled in the closets, the 20th century closets, and were left there to not be discovered again until the 70s.
True.
And yeah, but it's interesting to see when challenged to do something original, what quilt makers did in the 1930s with the fabrics that they had. And there were kind of these folk looking quilts that were made. Again, our book kind of does display the different kinds of quilts that the different kind of, some were pictorial, but like the spectrum. I mean, that is an amazing feat. I mean, she may have been looking at these sunrise quilts with all these concentric circles, but no, she came up with something really her own, and just swirling, swirling, swirling. And really, Richard Rowley, he's people were making map quilts prior to this, but they were maybe copying a map, maybe enlarging it. You can imagine how you do that. And he may have been doing that with a postcard, or I mean, people, I think, left to their own devices. It's interesting when you give people fabric, a pencil, a ruler, and maybe some other little tools, what they come up with. And that's the beauty of that contest.
And the opportunity to think that it could be shown, right? So I think a lot of people have those quilts are inside of them, right? But if they thought, well, this quilt that I want to make would never get me in the state fair, or would never get me shown, I would never win the ribbon, but then here they are given the opportunity to win a prize, and yes, do make your original pieces. And so I can imagine being of artistic spirit and feeling like that had unleashed me and given me permission, so to speak, right?
Absolutely. And a lot, yeah, I think we really hit it on the head. That is incredible. That's a really astute point there. Exhibition is a big part of being an artist, having the opportunity to share with a wider public and to get their reaction. I'm not an artist, but I do, I mean, I'm sure that's part of it. And prior to this, you're right. The opportunities to display your quilts were at state fairs. There were a few contests, but nothing on this scale. This was a national contest that, with 400 stores that Sears had divided in 10 regions, it had the potential to bring out some really high quality, innovative quilts.
And it did.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
And it did.
Look at that quilt on the front of that book. I mean, that quilt is still in the family too. That woman, oh my, she lived in Chicago. And anyway, her quilt there, you could see a little bit of her quilt in that one photo.
That looks a lot like the poster, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it turns out that the World Without End was a block that did come out, that Sue Roberts and the Sears staff did provide blocks for people to make their quilts, and one of them was that World Without End that she is using on that cover quilt. But she organized it in a really it could be a poster for the contest, for the whole World's Fair if they wanted to. It has the Sears building in the center and Fort Dearborn down below. It's in 1833, 1933. Yeah.
Well, I've learned so much from you today, Merikay, and I'm so pleased that you were able to join me to talk about this and give us more background to these quilts and the whole competition for the Sears show in 33.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, writing an article is hard, but to be, and I think the last one I've written, well, that book is probably the last one written about the contest, and the article in Quilter's newsletter. And I wrote an article in Quilt Folk recently, that an opportunity to kind of catch up. But this is for the Illinois issue. I wrote about the Sears quilt contest.
Okay.
But I appreciate having a chance and just to talk with you, to just kind of chat about this.
It's so much fun. Thank you so much, Merikay. Bye,
Okay,
everybody. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
joining us.
bye-bye.
Well, thanks also again for being my guinea pig, because you're such a good sport to always be my guinea